A teacher tells a story that on the first day of school, she was glancing over the roll when she noticed a number after each student's name, such as 154, 136, or 142. Wow, look at these IQs, she said to herself. What a terrific class. The teacher promptly determined to work harder with this class than with any other she ever had. Throughout the year, she came up with innovative lessons that she thought would challenge the students because she didn't want them to get bored with work that was too easy for them. She planned and worked hard, and her plan worked. The class outperformed all the other classes that she had taught in a usual way. Then, during the last quarter of the year, she discovered what those numbers after the students' names really were. Their locker numbers. Expectations, communication. One of my favorite statements here, it's not my statement, it actually came from a guy called Lawrence Peter. Oh, I'm not on here, huh? Okay. Okay, let's tell this story again. No, I won't tell you. One of my favorite statements in regards to leadership was made by Lawrence Peter in his book, The Peter Principle. He says, in a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his level of incompetence. Soak in for a while. The Peter Principle. It's so true. But you're not going to have any kind of leadership that's effective without communication. Moses is a classic example. And we'll get into him in just a moment. But maybe you have some questions about what we talked about at all. If you don't, then we'll get on to Moses. Anything about leadership that's a question on your mind or heart, anything we've talked about so far that you might have. If you don't, we'll just move on. No questions? As clear as mud? Okay, yes.
Why don't sometimes I think leaders understand maybe that they take more of a positional role than more of a relational role? Why is it so hard for people to see that in their own lives?
I think there's two reasons. I think one, it's self-serving, which we like. Positional self-serving. And number two, and I'm not saying that every positional leader is totally self-serving, but it has that tendency to be self-serving. And then number two, I think because traditionally, that's the way it's been. It's interesting when you study America, during the industrial age in the 19th century, and we had people on farms now closing them down, or at least dads now moving to the city to work in the factories. And the farms were not as important. Whereas in the past, the agriculture areas and so forth, a lot of the people lived on farms, and a lot of the sons and daughters grew up on farms and so forth. And it was much more of a participating kind of relationship between moms and dads and kids and so forth, and families and churches and all that. But slowly but surely the industrial age changed some of that as dads now started, because they couldn't make it on the farms, especially during the Depression, they started going to factories and so forth, and that kind of changed. Then we had factories with the great moguls and leaders, of course, the Carnegies and those kind of guys who ran corporations, you know. And they were CEOs, and so they were in charge. I mean, these guys were big, dominant, positional leaders. That kind of transitioned over into the church. It's interesting, when after the Second World War, Japan decided they want to build their industrial complex, they sent people over here, spies, to check out the industry in America. And of course, we were quite effective in industry. In fact, right after the Second World War, nobody else was selling anything. America had all the power. They had all the goods. They were doing all the selling because Europe was in turmoil. Japan was in turmoil. Much of the East was in Asia was in turmoil and self-destructed because, or a lot of destruction, I should say, because of the wars. So in America, we had some very successful corporations operating. So they sent people over to check out our corporations, and they really loved everything, the organizational structure, except the leadership structure. They rejected the positional leadership structure that our CEOs and courts and boards of leadership were incorporated into the corporate system. So the board of directors kind of concept, they basically kind of rejected. They felt like it wasn't as effective. Now they came at it from kind of a more religious, historical, traditional view as to what the Japanese believed in and how we should treat people. And a lot of that is built on their Buddhism and several other kinds of religious concepts. So they were very pleased to incorporate all of the basic information and techniques that they saw our U.S. corporations operate on, but they just rejected the CEO concept as far as it being the head and everything else was subservient. In fact, in Japan, they began developing some corporations like Toyota and some others, but when they did, they didn't allow the CEO to have a bigger office than the rest of the people had. They all had to have the same offices. And they met together and they planned things together as far as the business was concerned, and the projects and the future, the vision, all that was all done together as a corporate body. And so they rejected the CEO concept or the positional authority concept. And what's interesting is in the last 20 to 30 years, they have kind of gone back to a corporate CEO concept that we have. And it's gotten them into financial trouble. So right now, Japan's struggling financially. They got the same kind of problems we have, only worse. And they've been trying to get out of it. So debt's been a big problem for them. So I think when we look at the biblical concept of leadership, it's the most effective. It's the kind that works best. But the tendency has been towards the positional leadership because that's what we see corporations do, and it seems to work for them. So we think we can incorporate that into the church. But there's a big difference. The church operates with volunteer labor, you know, and corporations pay their people. And so the only one who gets paid is the preacher. And he didn't get paid enough, but anyway, we'll talk about that another time. So the idea then of trying to use corporate kind of positional leadership models in the church just hasn't worked very well. And so a lot of things aren't getting done, a lot of vision's not happening, a lot of commitment of the people, and all that is not working well with the positional kind of leadership model. But that's how it came into play. That's why we were doing it, and now it's so traditional, it's hard for us to get out of it. You know, when you get in a comfort zone, some kind of, you like your comfort zone, it's hard for you to get out of that comfort zone. And of course, I've mentioned Acts 8, which is a good example of the early church. They didn't want to leave Jerusalem. They didn't want to get out of that comfort zone. So God had to force them out. And today, they're almost having to be forced as well. Like I said, I get a lot of criticism from people when I talk about this material where I go, and especially from down south. That's changing, by the way, because it's unconventional as to the way we've operated. And when you bring in new leadership into an eldership, in fact, I can remember in one case that a church I was working with, we brought some new leadership in, and the leaders themselves were positional. I love the guys, they're good men, but they were positional in their thinking. And we brought in a couple of elders, new elders, they were just ordained. One was of the positional thinking, the other one was of the relational thinking. And guess who quit after a year? The relational thinking guy quit. Because the positional kind of leaders could put pressure on him to one degree or another. This is the way we've always done it, this is the way we're going to do it. And so the positional thinking leader, the new elder who was positional thinking, he fit right into it, no problem. But they kept looking at the relational leader in that eldership and kept kind of ostracizing him or voting him down or whatever, and saying, that's not the way we do it, you know, this is the way we do it. Finally he quit. So it's hard to change internally, isn't it? It's hard to do that. So my goal is to do what I can to impact churches as far as young people are concerned. And so that they'll see the future that has to change. And it really does have to change. And like I say, I was just out in LA a couple of months ago, and it just was amazing to me how many people told me that the churches down there are having struggles. Well, it's just not just LA, it's all over the brotherhood. It's more of a problem now than it was 20, 30 years ago. Because young people today will not submit to positional leadership anymore. It's just that's the way it is. I mean, that's just the way our society is to some degree. And so they're not willing to submit. I mean, we have young people today that too many times, not all of them, of course, not all of them, but many of them, too many times they're thinking in terms of what's in it for me. So if I'm thinking in terms of what's in it for me, I'm not going to listen to